Hello and welcome. I hope that this finds you all safe and well at home. As you know, this is our first video of many to come as we read the book Holes by Louis Sanchar together. Before we get started, I want to share some of the resources that I have provided for you and some of my expectations moving forward. Go ahead and log into Google Classroom and access your Holes study guide that can be found in the novel study section. In it, you will find all of the questions that we will discuss throughout these videos. You will also find extension activities, some that require you to do a little bit of research, some that require you to be creative and illustrate certain parts of the story, and others that include things like recipes, things that you can do with your family. So I do want you to have access to those so that you can follow along. In it, you will find the pre-reading activity. So I do want you to complete this before you continue reading with us. The pre-reading activity just requires you to have a discussion with somebody in your family about your family history. So I want you to take a look at that, read through that, facilitate that discussion, and then come back and join us. The second thing you'll notice in that folder is the ongoing character journal. Now, because Holes is such a complex book, it has a lot of characters, it has a lot of flashbacks, so different stories going on. It's important that we keep detailed notes of all of these settings, characters, and stories that take place, because we will come to find that all of these characters and events and stories that take place are somehow related to each other. So no matter how insignificant the details may seem in the beginning of the book, it's really important to pay close attention to those. As we get started with what we have on the agenda for today, we will be reading chapters 1 through 3. Now, if we think back to what we know about plot, the first part of a plot is the exposition. In the exposition, the setting, characters, and basic events take place. So throughout these 3 chapters, I really want you to pay close attention to the setting. So that includes place and time. I want you to be really descriptive in your notes. What does it look like? What does it feel like? I want you to imagine yourself within the setting of the story. You will also be introduced to some of the characters within the first 3 chapters. Please begin to take some notes about those characters. Think about their physical and behavioral traits so that you can keep track as we move forward. In these videos, I will present a picture to you, and this includes your I can statement for today, as well as the questions that I want you to focus on. So this one in chapter 1, we'll be paying close attention to the setting. And then the questions that I want you to really focus on are, what did you learn in this chapter about the setting of the story? And what is interesting about the name Camp Green Lake? So I will show you these periodically throughout our videos as we move to different chapters of the book. Just make sure that you're taking notes and that you pause this video in between so that you give yourself an opportunity to respond to those questions as we move throughout the story. We will get started with chapter 1 of Holes by Louis Sanchar. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it's just dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in the big dry lake. The only trees are the 2 old oaks on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and in the holes dug by the campers. Here's a good rule to remember about the rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day or two recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But if you don't want to be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, that is the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow, painful death, always. And if you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go in the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone else can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. The reader is probably asking, why would you go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He had never been to camp before. Chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write her at least once a week. He looked out on the window, although there was not much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he had just gotten away from camp for a little while, just like rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with the stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have to play soccer with a marble. Other times, they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off a table, tied to a broken rubber bands. Now, Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Miss Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in class and the lightest kid in class, and then had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Mrs. Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-to-1, unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of his no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no-good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things that went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of a telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice singing to him. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you needed 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same frontward and backward. So they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other child Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father had liked to say, "I learned from failure." But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out. Whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving to New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would now be living in a mansion on the beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment that smelled of burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he says, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out that his great-great-grandfather was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool. But she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived, Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. So we're going to stop there. That was chapters 1 through 3. Take a moment to access those notes. Make detailed responses to all of them. Make sure you're going back and pointing to text evidence. If you have to, you can rewind this video and rewatch it as many times as you'd like. Stay tuned, and I will see you tomorrow.